Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. This week we are looking at what I'm calling the curious tale of Mephibosheth. It's probably a pretty safe bet that you haven't ever heard of Mephibosheth, or if you have, it's likely that you haven't really paid a lot of attention to his small story in the Bible. His story is told in small snippets throughout the book of 2 Samuel. Yesterday, we set the stage by talking about the growing animosity between King Saul and David, about David's friendship with Saul's son Jonathan, and how there was a battle between Israel and the Philistines in which both King Saul and Jonathan were killed. All this paves the way for David to be king, and for the story of Mephibosheth. The first time we hear of Mephibosheth, he's only 5 years old. The Bible tells us that Saul's son Jonathan, who was David's dear friend, had a son whose name was Mephibosheth. When news of the battle came, the battle in which both Saul and Jonathan were killed, the nursemaid watching over Mephibosheth got up to flee. Now that might strike us as odd at first. The battle was a long way away, so why would she feel the need to flee so quickly? Well, the answer is that in those days, when a new king was established, the first thing a normal king would do would be to kill everyone in the household of the former king. The new king wouldn't want anyone left who might be a threat to his throne, and the surest way to do that would be to wipe out any relatives and servants. From the nursemaid's perspective, perhaps she thought that the sooner she fled, the farther away and safer she could get. So she grabbed up the 5-year-old Mephibosheth and headed out as quickly as she could. And that's when disaster happened. In her haste, she stumbled and dropped Mephibosheth, and something about the way he fell resulted in his feet being crippled. From that moment on, he was never able to walk. I think there's a lot in that story we can relate to. Our first touchstone might be the guilt we could suppose that the nursemaid felt for her part in what happened to Mephibosheth, a guilt she probably felt for the rest of her life. Every time she saw Mephibosheth, or in his inability to walk, or every time she thought about him, the guilt was there. And perhaps we have things in our lives that haunt us in similar ways, and we make our way through life with a dark cloud of doom and gloom hanging over us. But even in those times when we can't forgive ourselves, we still have the love and forgiveness of God. Our second connection to this story is probably something else we have all experienced. In trying to do something good, in trying to keep Mephibosheth safe, it turned out bad. Doesn't that sound familiar? Sometimes even the things we do thinking they will be good for everyone don't turn out that way. And we don't really know what to do with that. Our intentions were good, but we've got to live with less than a good outcome. And maybe there, too, we need to remember that we are loved by God. But then we come to Mephibosheth himself, and we find that third touchstone for us. Like Mephibosheth, we have probably all had things happen to us that have had lifelong consequences. This happened when Mephibosheth was 5 years old, and for the rest of his life he was crippled. His fall was a long fall indeed, with repercussions that endured. From that moment on, the direction of his life changed. And I'm sure he had bad days and times when he was down and depressed over all this. And yet there's never any indication in the Bible of that. Mephibosheth seemed to accept what had happened and moved forward to make the best of it. He seems to have gotten married and had a family. And perhaps we can learn from that too, to live in trust of God all our days. And as for what happens next, just wait and see. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.